Ukrainian Canadians here in Toronto are calling on the federal government to do more to help Ukraine as tensions with Russia boil over. Many gathering for a demonstration outside the Ukrainian consulate late this afternoon.
This as Canada announces new sanctions on Russia and commits to send up to 460 armed forces members to Latvia to bolster NATO in the face of Russian aggression. To discuss, we welcome to CP24 tonight Mark Schweck, chair of the Stand With Ukraine Committee at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Oral Braun, professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto, and Jeremy Kinsman, former Canadian ambassador to Russia and the UK. Thanks to all of you. Ambassador Kinsman, are these sanctions we're finding out about today enough to de-escalate tensions with Russia? Is Canada really hitting Russia where it hurts?
No, Canada isn't. I mean, Canada can't, quite frankly. But what Canada is doing, it's contributing to a very unified and determined and undivided response from NATO, and indeed from beyond NATO. I think that's the point. I mean, sending some soldiers to Latvia and a boat isn't going to make any difference. What's going to make a difference, I think, are the bigger sanctions announced by Biden, the ones he has not announced, the way in which it's going to hurt and hit Russian elites who have been going along with Putin's aberrant behavior. It's going to hit them, and the cancellation, or at least the suspension, suggesting a cancellation of the pipeline between Germany and Russia, and many things to come, which are going to rain some misery on the heads of Vladimir Putin's thinking.
Oral, we saw hundreds of sanctions after the annexation of Crimea. Is there anything else that could be done from the international community to see Russia de-escalate the situation?
There can be a lot more done, a lot more should be done. And we have to step back a little bit and recognize that we should not be in the current position. We are in the current position. Ukraine is facing the threat that it is because of the failure of Western deterrence. And we need to start with that as the basic reality on which we have to build a new deterrent against Russia. And Mr. Biden called this an invasion, but he's holding back sanctions for what? A new invasion? And I'm sorry, when we talk about Western unity, unity at what level? At the level of Germany, of doing virtually nothing? Or is it more at the level of Britain, which wants to have a more muscular policy towards Russia, or deeper sanctions and other kinds of actions? Are we taking more than just sanction actions? For instance, are we prepared to provide much more economic aid to Ukraine that we have? Are we prepared to provide them with more of the defensive armaments that they have been pleading for? It has to be more than Germany just sending helmets.
Mark, you were part of a group of people who were demonstrating outside the Ukrainian consulate this afternoon. How are Ukrainian Canadians feeling right now?
Well, they're feeling different anger first for Russia invading Ukraine. Disappointment with the Western reaction right now. There's just not enough heavy sanctions. They need to make it very painful on Putin, on his entourage, on all the oligarchs. They need to have personal sanctions, travel restrictions, seizing of wealth if they need to. As long as Russians can travel to the UK or to Paris or to Germany or Italy, buy property, enjoy life as is, there's going to be no pressure. They need to feel it hard. They need to feel it in their wallets.
Ambassador Kinsman, if we were to meet the might of Russia, to Oral's point that the world isn't actually responding in a big enough step as we see the Russians taking, what would that step look like then?
Yeah, Oral's wrong, frankly. The point here is incremental. This is an invasion. It is a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, and God knows, Canadians, I'm getting on. I was working on this stuff back when Charles de Gaulle declared "Vive le Québec libre." I know what it is when a part of your country gets recognized as a separate entity by another country. It's a vastly hostile act, and it requires resolute response right away. But I think that these things, Putin knows what the United States can do with respect to long-term financial exposure. And these things are going to come. Putin's very self-satisfied because he's got 620 billion US dollars in reserves. He's got oil at $93 a barrel. He thinks, I think he's wrong, but he thinks he's got the Chinese as a cushion of support. I don't think they are on this. But the idea is to prove him wrong. And you don't throw everything at him now because he doesn't care about sanctions. He will. What you've got to do is to use it to shape, to get hold of the initiative in this exercise. By the way, I agree totally with Mark. He is so right about cutting down on the travel privileges and the kind of detached acceptance of the elites and other middle-class people in Russia of Putin's behavior, which I think is going off the rails. He's absolutely right about that. Travel, it's got to make Russian citizens feel the hurt.
Orla, what do you make of this point? Do you think we're taking the right approach internationally? Does NATO have this wrong?
I wish I could agree with Jeremy, but it just doesn't make sense to say, you know, Putin is really going to come to his senses because they can't travel. When Dmitry Rogozin, a former deputy prime minister and ambassador to NATO, was told that visas would be denied, he said, tanks do not need visas. And that's the reality of hard power. So we need to again understand deterrence has failed. And we cannot allow Putin to turn Ukraine into a frozen conflict. So we don't just want to de-escalate some parts of it. We want to make sure that there's a deterrent that works now and it works in the future. And it has to be a combination of soft and hard power. We have to recognize that Russia is not a superpower. This is not the Cold War. This is a corrupt kleptocracy that has lots of nuclear weapons. It can bully its neighbors, but it's a country with a GDP in nominal terms roughly the size of Italy's. And here's the largest alliance in human history that is being bullied by Putin. Ukraine is not the end of his demands, it's the beginning of his demands. When Putin says, we will not allow any other enlargement of NATO, well, there may be enlargement of NATO that will be sought by Finland and by Sweden. Is he going to threaten to invade those countries as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate because we're seeing aggression from Putin, and then you have to ask yourself, do you meet that aggression? Because then he'll say, look at this Western aggression, right? So, Mark, in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk, there are people there who don't see Russia as aggressive, right? I mean, how is this going to be received in those areas that Putin's declared independent, but where we have Russian troops going in as peacekeepers?
Well, let's talk about Eastern Ukraine. First of all, Russia has been there for 8 years. They've essentially banned the Ukrainian language there. They've chased away all of the folks who were pro-Ukrainian. 1.4 million internal displaced people have left the region. So that caused a huge, essential ethnic cleansing of the area. They allowed people who remained with pro-Ukrainian views in particular were tortured, their buildings were broken into, they were terrorized to live there. So yeah, sure, the folks on the floor, on the ground there are going to be more pro-Russian because many of the Ukrainians are either in complete hiding or have left their houses behind. So there's a disproportionate view that people are pro-Russian. If you're pro-Ukrainian in Donbass today, you risk your life.
Ambassador Kingsman, you know, we're hearing a lot of language from politicians around saving democracy in this area. Does this beg the question of how important NATO is if it can't stop this crisis from continuing or escalating?
Look, NATO, I think Oral has forgotten, NATO just lost a war in Afghanistan to the Taliban. Let's not. This is not going to be settled by NATO versus Russia on the ground in a military conflict enveloping the whole of Europe. We've got to stop that, and it's not because we're intimidated. It's because it's insane. I feel terribly for the people of Ukraine. They are not pawns in this, and we've got to find ways of getting to Russia to keep them from pushing this farther without making concessions that are real. Okay, I think that this thing, there is still the door. It sure seems like it's shut. It may be ajar. I'm not looking for negotiations. I'm looking for Putin to get persuaded that this is getting. This is more. He's bitten off more than he can chew. I was very struck by the fact that during this staged meeting, this silly performance with all these guys in black suits in his cabinet and his security councils, that three guys who are his appointees, his cronies, who run the security agencies, actually said that they thought that he should pursue the route of negotiation farther, and he got irritated at it. But what that demonstrates is that Russians are uneasy about what's happening. Saying we're going to fight them on the beaches and everything else is unfortunately just going to rev up a negative response. We want to persuade them to stop the aggression, to stop the attacks on Ukraine's sovereignty, and get to the table.
All right, some very interesting points there. Thank you so much for your perspectives on this discussion. We appreciate that. Mark Schweck, Oral Braun, and former Ambassador Jeremy Kinsman, thanks.